In the 5th century BCE, a man named Herodotus set out to chronicle the histories of the known world. What he created was more than a mere collection of events. It was a tapestry of myths, cultures, kings, and empires. In Volume 1 of the Histories, Herodotus recounts the epic clashes between East and West, tells of Lydian kings like Gyges and the doomed Croesus, and takes us into the strange and sophisticated world of ancient Egypt. We encounter the Scythians, nomadic warriors of the steppe, and witness the rise of the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great and Dareios. These stories are more than historical footnotes. They are echoes of humanity's earliest attempts to understand itself. Join us as we step into the world of Herodotus, a world of glory, betrayal, gods, and ambition.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really getting into it, cracking open a stack of, well, truly ancient accounts. We're diving into reports about peoples and empires that, shaped the early world.
And our source material, it's from this renowned ancient observer, a fellow named Herodotus. He clearly traveled a lot, gathered stories extensively. We're talking accounts from places like Lydia, Persia, Egypt, Scythia, Libya. Quite the range.
Yeah, think of it as a shortcut, maybe, to getting informed about this incredible, diverse, and honestly often bewildering world, all seen through his eyes.
Right.
Our mission today, let's unpack these reports. We want to pull out the key insights, those facts that really stick with you, and, let's be honest, the stories that are just too wild to forget.
Definitely some wild ones in there.
So get ready for tales of power shifts, epic clashes, customs that might make your jaw drop a bit, and the very real challenge back then of just trying to piece together an understanding across huge distances thousands of years ago.
It's just a remarkable window, isn't it, into how one person tried to map out and describe the known world, basically grabbing information from whoever he could talk to. It's genuinely one of the earliest large-scale investigations of human society that we actually have.
Okay, so let's start our journey. It begins with a really fascinating look at the roots of conflict, particularly between East and West, at least as the Persians apparently told it.
Yes, their account traces the start of the wrongs, interestingly, not to some big military invasion initially, but to a series of abductions, like kidnappings, basically.
Right, like personal grievances escalating.
Exactly. They point to the Phoenicians carrying off Io from Argos. Then later, Hellenes, maybe Cretans, the source isn't totally sure, abducting Europa from Tyre.
So back and forth already.
And the cycle just continued. The Hellenes took Medea, and the Persians, well, they apparently saw the Trojan War, Priam, taking Helen as just balancing the scales, seeking satisfaction for Medea being taken earlier.
Wow. That's a different perspective on the Trojan War than you usually hear. Highlights a very different view of historical cause and effect, doesn't it?
It really does. A long memory for these perceived slights.
Okay, so moving into Lydia now. One of the really early stories Herodotus relays involves a king named Candales and his, let's just say, rather unsettling obsession with his wife's beauty.
Oh, yeah. He was so convinced she was the most beautiful woman ever, he actually compelled his own loyal guard, this guy Gyges, to hide and secretly watch her naked.
Which sounds incredibly risky and just wrong.
Deeply taboo, definitely. And of course, the queen discovered it, but her response is what's really striking. It wasn't just outrage at Gyges. She saw the king's action as the real problem, putting Gyges in this impossible spot.
So what did she do?
She gave Gyges this stark choice. Either kill Candales, take the kingdom, and marry her, or be killed himself for having seen her like that.
Wow. Some choice.
No kidding. Faced with that, Gyges chose survival and power. He killed Candales, became king, started a whole new dynasty.
And the source notes he got incredibly wealthy, right? And was one of the first non-Greeks to send these really rich gifts, votive offerings, to the oracle at Delphi in Greece.
That's right, significant dedications. His successor, Alyattes, kept expanding Lydian power, drove out groups like the Cimmerians. And his war with Miletus is interesting because of his, well, unusual siege tactics.
Oh, sight.
He wouldn't attack the city walls or destroy houses. Instead, he'd time his invasions for harvest season, march his army in playing music, burn all the right props, and then just leave.
Seriously, just burn the food and go.
Year after year, until the Milesians were desperate, basically starving. Then they finally made peace, and Alyattes actually built 2 temples for them. Strange way to win a war.
Very strange. Which brings us to his son, Croesus. A name still basically synonymous with wealth, isn't it?
Absolutely. And he's famous for that meeting with Solon, the Athenian wise man.
Right, the famous story where Solon sees all Croesus' riches but refuses to call him the happiest man.
Exactly. Solon basically says, call no man happy until he's dead, until his life has ended well, because fortune can turn on a dime. And the source makes a point of saying Croesus remembered those words later, in his darkest hour.
And that hour came, didn't it? But even before the big disaster, there was personal tragedy.
Oh, yeah. Croesus had this powerful dream predicting his son would be killed by an iron spear. So he did everything he could, kept him out of battles, even away from hunting.
Trying to control fate.
Totally. But then, during a boar hunt, which he'd reluctantly allowed his son to join this man named Adrastos, someone Croesus had actually taken in and purified from a previous accidental killing.
Oh no, don't tell me.
Yep. Adrastos accidentally killed Croesus' son with a spear, fulfilling the dream prophecy tragically. It's like Solon's point playing out right there, even before the war with Persia.
Just brutal irony. Okay, so the ultimate turn of fortune. The war against Cyrus and the rising Persian Empire.
Right. And Croesus gets this famously ambiguous oracle, doesn't he? If Croesus goes to war against the Persians, he will destroy a great empire.
Classic oracle vagueness. So he thinks it means Persia.
Seems so. He crosses the Halys River, and the source even describes how they supposedly did it by diverting the river flow, which is pretty clever engineering, if true.
Okay.
They fight an initial battle, kind of indecisive. Croesus pulls back, maybe thinks the campaign season is over, dismisses part of his army.
Big mistake.
Huge. Cyrus hears about this and marches on Sardis, incredibly fast.
And then there's that tactic Cyrus used.
Oh, brilliant move against the famous Lydian cavalry. Cyrus knew horses were spooked by camels, so he put his baggage camels right in the front line.
No way!
Yeah. The Lydian horses apparently freaked out, bolted, totally neutralized their main advantage. Persians win. Croesus is captured.
And then the famous scene on the pyre.
Yes.
Right.
Placed on this massive pyre, probably about to be sacrificed or executed, and he cries out Solon's name 3 times.
Which gets Cyrus's attention.
Right. Cyrus is intrigued, asks what's going on, has Croesus spared and brought down.
And Croesus tells him the whole story about Solon.
Exactly. Recounts the meeting, explains the warning about fortune, and Cyrus, hearing this, seeing the proof right in front of him, he's moved. Spares Croesus, even keeps him as an advisor sometimes.
But Croesus still had a bone to pick with the war.
Oh, yeah. Later, he sends his actual fetters, his chains, to Delphi and asks the god, basically, was this fair? Did you trick me?
And the oracle's response.
Classic again. The oracle says the prophecy was fulfilled. A great empire was destroyed.
His own.
His own. And they add this fascinating layer that this downfall was also partly fated. A delayed payment for his ancestor Gyges' original crime against Cambyses generations before.
Wow, so fate and past actions all tangled up. Incredible. Any other interesting Lydian customs mentioned?
Well, the source says their customs were mostly like the Greeks, except for this rather strange practice of prostituting their daughters to raise dowries. But maybe their biggest legacy noted is that they were, as far as the observer could tell, the first people to actually coin gold and silver money.
Game changer.
Absolutely. And there's a quick mention of the Lake of Gyges near a big tomb mound.
Okay, so from Lydia and Persia, this ancient observer takes us somewhere claiming even deeper roots. Egypt.
Yes, the Egyptians asserting they were the oldest nation. And Herodotus recounts this, well, let's call it an experiment by King Psammetichos to test that claim.
The one with the isolated children.
That's the one. He supposedly had 2 infants raised by a shepherd in total silence, no human speech allowed, just to see what language they'd naturally speak first.
That's a very direct approach to linguistics. What happened?
Reportedly, the first word they uttered sounded like bekos. They looked into it and found bekos was the Phrygian word for bread. So, based on that, the Egyptians apparently conceded that the Phrygians must be the older nation. It's a fascinating story about how ancients thought about origins and language.
Definitely. Another huge Egyptian topic is the Nile, right? The source seems obsessed with it.
Understandably. Its annual flooding was this huge mystery. It would rise consistently for 100 days right after the summer solstice, then recede. Nobody seemed to know why.
What were the theories he heard?
He mentions a few. One was the sun drawing the water up somehow. Another involved a mythical river, Oceanus, circling the world. A third was melting snow or rain far to the south.
Did you buy any of them?
He seemed to lean towards the snow rain idea, even though he expresses doubt about snow existing that far south, in Libya, as he thought of it. He also notes this odd thing, no cool breeze coming off the river, which he found strange because he thought breezes came from cold and the Nile region was hot.
He even mentions a legendary source, doesn't he?
Yeah, somewhere way upriver, between two mountains named Crophi and Mophi, still shrouded in mystery for him.
But what really seems to define the Egyptians in these accounts is their religion.
Oh, absolutely. Herodotus calls them excessively religious, maybe the most religious people he knew, and the details really back that up.
Like the priest.
Yeah, incredibly strict rules, shaving their heads and entire bodies every day or every other day, only wearing freshly washed linen garments, rinsing their bronze drinking cups constantly.
And their sacrifices.
Also very specific. They'd ritually curse the head of the sacrificed animal, pile sins onto it, then either sell it to Greeks if any were around, or throw it in the river. They wouldn't eat the heads themselves.
And it varied by region.
Like in Thebes, they held goats sacred but sacrificed sheep. In Mendes, it was the opposite. And unique practices like no sex inside temples and having to bathe after intercourse before entering a sacred space, details that really paint a picture of religion woven into everything.
Which gods are most important?
Isis and Osiris, who they equated with the Greek Dionysus, seemed universally revered. Zeus, or Amun as they called him, was central in Thebes. He finds it interesting that temples to Heracles, especially one in Tyre, seemed much older than the Greek hero Heracles, suggesting the name might have an earlier, different origin.
What about their festivals? They sound pretty lively.
Extremely. The festival for Artemis at Bubastis involved huge numbers of people traveling by boat, playing music, shouting, women exposing themselves, apparently a lot of wine drinking, maybe even some ritualized fighting.
Sounds chaotic.
And the one for Ares at Papremis involved a mock battle where priests defended a shrine with clubs against other men, also armed with clubs. Intense stuff. But he also notes the Oracle of Leto at Buto was considered the most truthful and respected in Egypt.
And the animal reverence is just on another level.
Totally. Cats especially. If a house caught fire, the priority was apparently saving the cats, even over putting out the fire. People would rush in to rescue them.
Seriously.
That's what he reports. And mourning rituals were specific. If a cat died naturally, the whole household shaved their eyebrows. If a dog died, they shaved their entire bodies and heads.
Wow, and they buried them.
Yep. Cats were embalmed and taken to a sacred city, Bubastis. Dogs were buried in special tombs within their own cities.
What about other animals?
Yeah.
Crocodiles.
Crocodiles were sacred in some areas, like near Thebes and Lake Moeris. They were even tamed, fed, adorned with jewelry. But in other areas, like Elephantine, they were hunted. Herodotus describes a hunting method. Baiting a hook with pork, dragging the croc ashore, and immediately plastering his eyes with mud to make it easier to handle.
Practical. Any others?
River horses, hippos, were sacred in Papremis. He also mentions the ibis birds, distinguishing between black ones that supposedly fought off flying serpents from Arabia and white ones that were just everywhere.
Fascinating. Does he give glimpses into daily life too?
A few. Things like using oil from sesame or castor beans, the many uses of date palms, food, wine, honey, boat construction using acacia wood, papyrus caulking, and bitumen. And this neat detail about river transport. They sailed downstream easily, but going upstream against the current was so hard they'd often tow boats from the bank or use a special stone anchor. For larger cargo boats, like those bringing goods from Ethiopia, asses would carry the hides back upstream after the boat was dismantled or sold.
Smart. And what about death and burial beyond the animals?
He describes different levels of embalming. The most expensive involved removing the brain, rinsing the abdomen with palm wine, filling it with spices, and soaking the body in natron for 70 days. Then there were cheaper methods. One just using an enema to dissolve the insides, and the cheapest just rinsing the belly.
So, options for everyone.
Pretty much. He also mentions a Babylonian practice of burying the dead in honey, comparing it to something perhaps done in Egypt too, though Egyptian mourning involved more public wailing. And some strange customs reported, like burning incense after sex, or women sitting at a temple of a goddess identified as Melita, possibly offering themselves.
Okay, shifting to structures. The scale of Egyptian engineering has blown him away.
Absolutely. He mentions King Sesostris digging canals everywhere, which apparently made the land difficult for horses and chariots later, and his huge statues. Then, of course, the pyramids.
Cheops, Chephren, Macarinos.
Right. He gives dimensions for Cheops' pyramid, 800 feet square at the base, and the same height, built with massive polished stones. He talks about the incredible labor involved, the causeway built just to move the stones.
Doesn't he mention a controversial story about Cheops funding it?
Yeah, he relates a story that Cheops even made his own daughter work in a brothel to raise money. Herodotus sounds a bit skeptical, but reports it. He also dismisses another story he heard that a famous courtesan named Rhodopis built one of the smaller pyramids, saying she lived much later than the pyramid builders.
But he saw something even more impressive than the pyramids.
The labyrinth near Lake Moeris. He says it surpasses the pyramids, an incredible complex of 12 covered courts, corridors, and 3,000 chambers, 1,500 above ground, 1,500 below. He says he saw the upper ones himself, and they were beyond description, but wasn't allowed into the underground ones where kings and sacred crocodiles were supposedly buried.
Wow. 3,000 chambers.
Astonishing. He also mentions a massive single-stone shrine, a monolith house, brought all the way from Elephantine to Sais, another huge feat of transport.
Beyond the big structures, there's some great historical anecdotes, too.
Oh, yeah. Like the story of the clever thief who robbed King Rhampsinitos' treasury. The architect had built in a secret movable stone. His sons used it after his death. One gets caught in a trap, tells his brother to cut off his head so he won't be identified.
Grim.
The brother does it. The king hangs the headless body up, sets guards. The brother gets the guards drunk, shaves half their beards as an insult, and steals the body. The king is so impressed by his cunning, he offers his daughter to whoever tells the best story of wicked cleverness. The thief tells his story, and the king lets him marry the princess.
Unbelievable. What else?
There's the blind king Anisus hiding in the marshes during an Ethiopian invasion. The Ethiopians eventually leave because of a dream oracle. Then there's Sithos, a priest king whose army abandoned him facing an Assyrian invasion. He prays, and overnight, field mice supposedly swarm the Assyrian camp and chew through their bowstrings and shield handles, causing them to flee. Divine intervention via mice.
Mice saving the kingdom.
Yeah. And the story of the 12 kings who ruled jointly until an oracle said whoever poured a libation from a bronze bowl in the temple would rule all Egypt. Psammetichos accidentally uses his bronze helmet instead of a gold cup like the others, fulfilling the prophecy unintentionally. The others exile him, but he eventually comes back and takes sole power.
Fate and accidents again.
Exactly. Then King Necho, who started digging a canal from the Nile to the Red Sea, but stopped after huge loss of life, and an oracle warned him he was working for the barbarian.
But Necho did something else amazing, right? The circumnavigation.
Yes. He sent Phoenician sailors out from the Red Sea with orders to sail around Libya, Africa, and return via the Mediterranean. They reportedly did it, taking several years, planting crops along the way. Herodotus says he doesn't really believe most of their story, except for one detail they reported, that as they sailed west around the southern tip, they had the sun on their right side, to the north.
Which would only happen in the southern hemisphere.
Precisely. The very detail that made Herodotus doubt actually helps convince us they probably did it. Incredible navigational feat.
Amazing. Any other kings stand out?
Samus, Necho's son, apparently invited officials from the Greek Olympic Games to Egypt for advice, and the Egyptians basically critiqued their roles, finding flaws. Then there's Amasis, who overthrew King Apries. He was initially looked down on for not being noble, but proved his worth. He was friendly to Greeks, allowed them to settle at Nakates.
Didn't he have dealings with Polycrates of Samos?
Yeah, the guy with incredible luck. Amasis basically warned him his constant good fortune was unnatural and advised him to throw away his most prized possession to avert disaster. Polycrates threw an emerald ring into the sea, only for it to turn up days later inside a fish presented to him. Amasis apparently broke off their alliance then, sensing disaster was inevitable for Polycrates, which it was.
Foreshadowing again. Throughout all this, Herodotus is constantly comparing cultures, isn't he?
He really is, noting where Greeks might have borrowed names of gods or religious customs from Egypt, suggesting the phallic Hermes images came from the Pelasgians, or things like ritual wailing or four-horse chariots possibly coming from the Libyans. He's fascinated by these connections.
And he's open about conflicting stories.
Very much so. He'll give different versions of Eo's abduction or Scythian origins or how Dareios became king. He explicitly says things like, "I don't believe it myself," or "some people say this," or "as is reported." It shows he wasn't trying to write a single perfect history, but compiling the different accounts he gathered.
You really get a sense of him as an investigator, right?
Yeah, definitely. Trying to piece it together. You see his personal observations popping up, actually visiting the labyrinth, seeing pitch extraction in Zakynthos, asking priests questions, estimating distances based on sailing times, noting the size of that huge Scythian bronze bowl. He's actively trying to verify and understand.
Which brings us perfectly to the Scythians, Talk about a different world from Egypt or Lydia.
Absolutely. The vast kind of wild steppes north of the Black Sea. He touches on their origins myths involving Targetaus, son of Zeus, and a river nymph, or maybe Heracles leaving behind a bow only his true Scythian son could string.
And the land itself sounds incredibly hard.
Oh, yeah. He describes 8 months of unbearable frost, the sea and the Bosphorus freezing solid enough to drive wagons over, constant snow, which he compares to feathers falling so thick you can't see, mostly just vast, treeless plains crossed by huge rivers like the Ister, Danube, Borysnes, Dnieper, and Tanais.
And the people, lots of different tribes.
Whole array. You've got the powerful royal Scythians who considered others their slaves, nomadic Scythians, agricultural Scythians living near the Borysthenes, the Neroi, who supposedly turned into wolves once a year. Herodotus doubts this and fled their land because of snakes. The Budinoi, living in a huge city made entirely of wood. The Andraphagoi, literally man-eaters, cannibals. The Melanclanimoi, black cloaks. The Agathyrsians, described as luxurious, fond of gold, sharing their women communally. And the Tauroi in the Crimea, known for sacrificing shipwrecked sailors and enemies to a virgin goddess and putting heads on poles. A really diverse and often intimidating landscape of cultures.
And some of their customs sound, well, pretty extreme to a Greek observer.
Understatement. The practice of blinding slaves, supposedly to make it easier for them to process mare's milk by stirring it after air was blown into the mares using bone tubes, seems bizarre, but that's the report.
And warrior customs.
Brutal. Drinking the blood of the first enemy killed, scalping foes, and using the scalps as napkins or sewing them together for cloaks. Making drinking cups out of enemy skulls, sometimes gilded. Flaying the skin off enemies' right arms, hands and all, to use as quiver covers.
Grim stuff. What about religion? Human sacrifice?
Yes, uniquely, they sacrificed humans primarily to Ares, their god of war. They didn't use statues, but represented Ares with an ancient iron sword set atop a huge platform of brushwood. They sacrificed livestock, horses, and once a year, 1 out of every 100 prisoners of war to this sword symbol.
How do they practice divination?
With bundles of willow wands, apparently. They'd lay them out, then gather them up one by one while speaking prophecies. There were also diviners who used lime-bast fibers. And getting a prophecy wrong was dangerous.
How so?
If the king was ill, he'd call the prophets. If they accused someone specific of swearing falsely by the royal hearth, the capital crime, and other prophets disagreed, the accused prophets faced a terrible fate. They'd be bound, put on an ox cart filled with dry wood, set on fire, and the oxen sent running. Often, the prophet's sons were killed too, just to be sure.
That's harsh. And royal funerals were equally intense.
Incredibly so. When a king died, his body was gutted, filled with herbs, coated in wax. Then it was put on a wagon and paraded through all the different Scythian territories he ruled. In each place, the people would mourn by cutting off parts of their ears, shaving their hair, cutting their arms, foreheads, noses, even piercing their left hands with arrows.
Ouch. And the burial itself.
After the tour, they'd bury him in a huge square pit. In the space around him, they'd bury one of his concubines, strangled, his cupbearer, cook, groom, messenger, horses, all killed to accompany him. Then they'd build a massive earth mound over it all.
It didn't end there, did it?
No. A year later, they performed another ritual. They took 50 of the king's best remaining young servants and 50 of his finest horses, strangled them all, gutted and stuffed them, and then impaled them on stakes in a circle around the tomb mound. The dead riders mounted on the dead horses like a final, gruesome honor guard.
That is profoundly disturbing. It really paints a picture of a very different worldview.
It certainly does. And a key theme from these Scythian accounts is their fierce resistance to outside influence, particularly Greek customs.
Right, you mentioned stories about Scythians who adopted foreign ways.
Yes, 2 prominent examples. Anacharsis, a Scythian noble who traveled widely in Greece, learned a lot, but was supposedly killed by his own brother, the Scythian king, for performing rites to the mother of the gods he'd seen in Kyzikos.
Just for adopting a foreign ritual.
Apparently so. And then there was Skiles, a Scythian king whose mother was Greek. He learned Greek, preferred Greek ways, even secretly got initiated into the Bacchic mysteries in a Greek town. When his Scythian followers found out, they rebelled, drove him out, and he was eventually beheaded by his replacement.
So a very strong reaction against assimilation.
Extremely strong. These stories really hammer home how much they valued maintaining their own traditions and resisted anything foreign.
Did Herodotus get any sense of their population size?
He mentions a place called Exampeos between the Borysthenes and Hypanis rivers where there was supposedly an enormous bronze bull. The story went that a Scythian king wanted to count his people, so he ordered every man to bring one bronze arrowhead. They melted them all down to make this bowl, which Herodotus reports was 6 fingers thick and held 600 amphor, a huge volume. He uses this as evidence of their vast numbers.
Interesting way to take a census. Now, their big interaction with the outside world in these accounts is the Persian invasion under Dareios, right?
Yes, that's a major narrative. Dareios decides to invade Scythia, partly for revenge for past Scythian raids, partly just expansion. He builds bridges across the Hellespont and the Ister. And they mean
It's Scythian strategy.
pure nomadic defense. Refuse pitched battle. Constantly retreat, fill in wells, burn grazing land, scorched earth. They just kept drawing the massive Persian army deeper and deeper into their endless, empty territory, harassing them but never engaging fully.
Until Dareios got frustrated.
Exactly. He sends a message basically saying, fight me or submit. The Scythians sent back these symbolic gifts: a bird, a mouse, a frog, and 5 arrows.
Meaning?
The Persians debated it. Dareios thought it meant submission. The mouse lives on earth, the frog in water, earth and water. The bird is like a horse, speed surrender, and the arrows meant giving up their arms. But a wiser advisor interpreted it differently and likely correctly. Unless you Persians can fly away like birds, hide in the earth like mice, or leap into the water like frogs, you will not escape our arrows. Basically, defiance.
Much more likely. Did they say anything else?
Their verbal reply to Dareios' demand for earth and water was also classic Scythian bluntness. They basically said they had no cities or crops to defend, so why fight? But if the Persians wanted to fight, they should find the tombs of their ancestors and try to disturb them, then they'd see how Scythians could fight. And instead of offering earth and water, they just sent those symbolic gifts, adding a final insult by referring to Dareios not as king, but merely as our master in a mocking way.
Ouch. And there's that story about the hare.
Right. Just perfectly sums up their attitude. The two armies are finally drawn up, tense, potentially about to engage in this massive battle. Suddenly, a hare runs out between the lines, and the entire Scythian army just breaks formation, whooping and chasing after the hare.
You're kidding. During a face-off with the Persian Empire?
That's the story. Dareios sees this and basically says, these guys clearly have utter contempt for us. We need to get out of here. It showed how little they cared for conventional warfare or Persian might.
So how did Dareios get away? The bridge over the Ister was key, wasn't it?
Crucial. The Scythians actually rode ahead and tried to persuade the Ionian Greeks guarding the bridge to dismantle it and leave the Persians stranded. Some Ionians were tempted.
But they didn't.
No. Histories, the tyrant of Miletus, argued they owed their power to Dareios and should remain loyal. He came up with a clever plan. They pretended to agree with the Scythians, started dismantling the bridge just enough from the Scythian side to fool them, told the Scythians to go find the Persians, and then secretly kept the main part intact for Dareios' eventual retreat.
Smart move by Histories. Saved the Persian army.
Pretty much. Dareios retreated, his invasion a failure, having barely even fought the Scythians, but suffering losses from the harsh conditions and constant harassment.
Okay, so from the cold northern steppes, the observer's journey in these accounts also takes us south and west to the edges of the known world Livia.
Right, exploring North Africa and beyond. Herodotus tries to define the vast extent of Libya. He mentions a Persian noble named Ctesippus who was ordered by Xerxes to circumnavigate Africa as a punishment, but turned back out of fear, claiming his ship just stopped moving. Herodotus also draws on accounts from Carthaginians who were active traders along the coast.
What kind of peoples did he describe there?
A real variety again. Tribes like the Nasamonians, known as plunderers. They had interesting customs, burying their dead sitting up, taking oaths by touching the tombs of their most respected ancestors, and practicing divination by sleeping on those same tombs to receive dream oracles. There's also a story about them being wiped out by a huge sandstorm blown by the south wind when they went to war against it, possibly the origin of the Scilly tribe, known for snake charming.
Wow. And that strange description of the interior.
Yeah, this really remarkable picture of a belt of habitable land deep in the desert. He describes it as a ridge running west, dotted every 10 days' journey or so by hills of salt with springs of sweet water gushing out beside them. People lived near these springs.
What were they like?
Further west along this ridge, he mentions the Garamantes hunting Ethiopian cave dwellers with chariots. Even further west, near a mountain called Atlas, the Pillar of Heaven, live the Atlantes, who supposedly ate no living creatures and never dreamed, really pushing the boundaries of the known and perhaps into the mythical.
Any Libyan customs that seemed familiar or noteworthy?
He notes that nomadic Libyans generally avoided eating cows, linking it to Egyptian reverence for Isis, often depicted with cow horns. Some also abstain from swine, but he also points out practices shared with Greeks. The ritual crying or wailing, ologe, performed during sacred rites, which he says Libyan women did particularly well.
Interesting connection.
And yoking 4 horses abreast to a chariot, which he thinks the Greeks learned from the Libyans. He even speculates that the Greek goddess Athena's aegis, her goatskin garment, might derive its name and form from the fringed goatskin cloaks worn by Libyan women.
Fascinating attempts to trace cultural links. Any other strange reports from that region?
There's one about an island called Kiraus off the coast, where girls supposedly collected gold dust from a lake using bird feathers dipped in pitch. Herodotus explicitly says he's just reporting what he heard, and contrasts it with something he did see himself. Pitch being drawn up from water using a myrtle branch in Zakynthos, a Greek island. It shows his preference for eyewitness accounts when possible.
Good example of his method. The Greek colony of Cyrene in Libya also features. Right?
Yes, it's founding by people from the island of Thera, guided by an oracle from Delphi. There's the story of the founder, Batos, who might have had a stammer, and the oracle possibly playing a role in his name or even curing him. And a grim backstory about his mother, Phronime, whose stepmother tried to get rid of her by sending her off with a merchant instructed to throw her overboard.
Did he?
No, the merchant saved her, took her to Crete where she had Batos, who later led the colonists to Libya. Later on, we hear about Ariandes, the Persian governor of Egypt, who got into trouble for trying to mint his own silver coinage, imitating Dareios' gold darks. Dareios saw it as rebellion and had him executed.
Don't mess with the king's currency.
Seems like it. And then there's a really dark story involving Firtime, the mother of King Arcesilaus of Cyrene. After her son was killed in Barca, she appealed to Ariandes for help. The Persians besieged and captured Barca through trickery.
And Firtime got her revenge.
Oh, brutally. She had the men responsible impaled and cut off their wives' breasts and nailed them to the city gates. Just horrific vengeance. But the source adds that Firtime herself died a horrible death soon after, becoming infested with worms while still alive. This was seen, Herodotus suggests, as divine punishment for her excessive cruelty.
Another echo of that theme, fortune-turning. Excessive actions leading to grim ends.
Exactly. It runs through many of these stories. He also makes a general observation about Libya having 4 races or peoples, 2 native, Libyans and Ethiopians, and 2 immigrant, Phoenicians and Hellenes, and he points out the exceptional fertility of one small region, Knips, comparing its grain yields favorably even to Babylon, highlighting how geography influenced life.
So, pulling back from all these specific places and stories, what does this whole collection tell us about how this ancient observer saw the world and gathered his information?
Well, as we've touched on, he's clearly interested in cultural exchange, noting potential borrowing of customs, names, and technologies between peoples, Greeks from Egyptians, maybe from Libyans, Pelasgians influencing Greeks. He doesn't see these cultures in total isolation.
And crucially, he presents different versions of events.
Yes, that's so important. He doesn't hide the contradictions he encountered, whether it's the reasons for Eo's abduction, Scythian origins, how Dareios seized power, or the details of Cyrene's founding. He often gives multiple accounts. He uses phrases like, the Persians say this, but the Phoenicians say that, or some report.
He lets you know he's weighing different sources.
Yeah. Exactly. And sometimes he injects his own skepticism, right? I don't believe it. Or qualifying things with, as is reported. This isn't someone claiming infallible divine knowledge. It's someone compiling human reports, acknowledging their variations, and sometimes questioning their plausibility. It's a recognizably historical or maybe proto-historical method.
You really feel him grappling with the material, trying to sift through it.
You do, and grounding it where he can with his own observations, actually seeing the labyrinth, noting the pitch wells, asking Egyptian priests about their history, trying to calculate distances. He's investigating, using the tools he had back then to try and make sense of this huge, complex world he was encountering through travel and hearsay.
So this deep dive has really taken us on quite a journey, hasn't it? Across this vast map of the ancient world drawn from these accounts, from Lydia and Persia, through Egypt's mysteries, across the Scythian steppes to the edges of Libya.
Yeah, we've encountered empires rising and falling, like Lydia crushed by Persia. We've seen these incredibly diverse customs, some familiar, some profoundly alien, the religious practices, the burial rites, the views on foreigners. And we've gotten glimpses into daily life, beliefs, conflicts.
All through the lens of this one ancient compiler, Herodotus.
Right. And these accounts he gathered, they offer just incredible insights, not just into those specific societies, but into the whole process of how cultures understood each other or misunderstood each other, the challenges of bridging those gaps, and recurring things too: power, fate, religion.
It's this amazing mix, isn't it? Grand historical narratives like Dareios and Invasion, alongside these tiny, specific, sometimes bizarre details: skull cups, mice saving kingdoms, dream interpretations.
That's what makes it so rich, I think. It feels very human in its scope and its messiness.
So, thinking about all this, what stories or customs from these ancient accounts really stand out most to you personally? What does hearing about them make you reflect on? Maybe about how cultures interact, or how they remember their past, or how they deal with the kind of unpredictable fate that Solon talked about?
It's a lot to process.
Definitely. These incredible reports, with all their sometimes conflicting stories and strange details, they really leave us contemplating, don't they? How much is our own understanding of others shaped by our own viewpoint? And are there maybe some core human experiences like the capriciousness of fortune that Solon warned Croesus about, seen again with Polycrates and Fear Time, that resonate across these vast differences in time and culture? Something to think about.